Hello, everybody. This is Chris Hislop from the Montana World Affairs Council. We're bringing Montana to the world and the world to Montana. It's another week of Connect Montana. It's Asia Week this week. In partnership with the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana, and with the help of a government official from New Zealand and the Councils General from South Korea and Japan, we will be examining the COVID-19 response in the region and in their respective countries and discuss lessons learned. Our first guest is Mr. Chris Carter. He is a former New Zealand government minister responsible for education and a number of other portfolios, including environment, housing, and local government. A former United Nations official with field experience in Afghanistan and Myanmar. Currently, Chris is an elected local government and health official in Auckland, New Zealand. Chris, over to you.
From Auckland, New Zealand. It's now 6 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday morning. We're 18 hours ahead of Mountain Time in the US. Thank you very much for having me on the Montana World Affairs Council Connect Montana program. Can you hear me okay? Great. Excellent. Thank you. Well, many of your listeners will have seen comments about New Zealand, I guess, on in response to the COVID-19 response globally. New Zealand has been praised in British and American media, as well as elsewhere in the world, for our very rapid response. So I know that this pandemic has now struck about 177 countries. It's global, and different countries have responded to the challenges that COVID-19 presents in different ways. New Zealand has taken a very proactive approach, and so I'd like to talk about that. So, as a contrast to some other places, and I'd like to talk about how we have, at this point in the program to mitigate the crisis, the impact of the COVID-19, we have had some success in flattening the curve. We've started off with quite a few advantages. One, that we were one of the very last developed countries to be affected by the crisis, by the virus. It wasn't until the 28th of February that our first case was identified, a young New Zealander returning from Europe. The government, our very remote geography, we're a country that doesn't, one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have any neighbours. Our nearest neighbour to New Zealand is Australia, and that's some 1,200 miles from New Zealand, and we have, therefore it's possible to close off the country. Australia also is a country that has no land borders with anybody else, and so it's interesting that both New Zealand and Australia have both been quite successful in the last 3 months in flattening the curve. We also have been lucky in New Zealand that we have a strong and empathetic leader in Jacinda Ardern. She has demonstrated very strong leadership qualities, not just in this crisis, but some of your listeners may recall that last year, New Zealand experienced its first and, so thank goodness, only terrorist attack when an Australian white nationalist attacked two mosques in Christchurch on the 15th of March last year. And the response of Jacinda and the government to that crisis was very, very strong. It received a lot of credit around the world, and she demonstrated then that she was a person who reacted quickly to a crisis. She engaged with the population. She identified the causes of the problem, and she took swift action. In this case, in the case last year of the terrorist attack, we tightened our gun laws very considerably, and that had very wide support. So a proven leader, a strong leader, a leader who was well connected to the people was a great advantage for New Zealand in this current crisis. Yesterday, after identifying the first case on the 28th of February, yesterday we have had to date 1,469 cases. We've had 19 deaths, sadly. We've had about 1,180 people recover, and there are about only 270 active cases at the moment, of which 7 only are in hospital, 1 in ICU. we've done 123,000 tests, and the government believes that if it had to, it could follow 300 individual cases with the very extensive both manual and electronic tracking systems that we've put in place. Now, how have we been able to achieve this quite good response to the COVID-19 with only 19 dead in a population of 5 million? Well, we've done it through good planning. As soon as COVID was identified by WHO as a potential global threat, the government set up in mid-January a health committee to prepare New Zealand for what we thought would be the inevitable arrival of the virus. There was a very swift response once the first case was identified. As the numbers started to creep up, the virus was introduced by New Zealanders returning to the country, primarily from Europe, but also some from Iran. By the 24th of March, the government went into a complete lockdown. So we've just finished, as I speak, 5 weeks of lockdown where only essential industries are operating. All shops, coffee shops, schools, and so on have been closed. And that's from a peak of 80 cases earlier on at the beginning of the lockdown. Yesterday, only 5 cases were identified. And for the last 9 days, there have been numbers have not gone over 10. So we appear to have been successful in squashing the curve in any rate. The Prime Minister has engaged in the daily press briefings, but these have been very science focused, and they have not been led by the Prime Minister, but by the Director General of Health, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, who, a bit like Dr. Fauci, has become a national figure, a much loved figure. He's a young doctor who has explained quite complex medical issues in a very clear way to the population. It's people have seen and had every issue around the virus explained, questions from reporters and so on a daily basis. So the government's response has been a very science-based response. The Prime Minister said right at the beginning of the lockdown on the 26th of March, we're going hard and we're going fast. And yesterday, when she announced that today we will move into a phase where schools, some school children will return, some businesses will open. We call that response level 3. She announced yesterday that if there are any community transmission cases that occur, and we haven't had any community transmission cases for weeks, if there are any identified, then phase 3 will continue until we are confident that the virus is absolutely contained. The government response has been very politically inclusive. Right at the beginning of the response to the COVID-19, the government set up Parliament, of course, has been adjourned as a response to the COVID-19, but a special committee was set up by the government called the Epidemic Response Committee. It's chaired by the Leader of the Opposition. It has 11 parliamentarians on it, 6 of them from the opposition, 5 from the government. And the responsibility of that committee is to act as an oversight committee on the government's actions during the COVID crisis. Because, of course, like the United States, New Zealand has taken a very strong response in supporting small businesses, providing funds to companies to make sure their workers are still employed throughout the crisis. We've basically put 13 billion New Zealand dollars, which translates to about 7 billion US, as a stimulus package into supporting jobs, making sure that nobody is going hungry and so on. We are lucky in that we have had a very strong social welfare system right from the 1930s. New Zealand has a free public health system like most developed countries, with a very developed infrastructure around health and education services and so on. Our minimum wage is $15. That's a national minimum wage, and unemployment is there's been a strong tradition of all New Zealanders being eligible for unemployment should they lose their jobs, and that dates again back to the 1930s. So in all of those regards, it's given New Zealand an advantage. I'm not sure how familiar with the geography and population of New Zealand your listeners are, but New Zealand is a little bit smaller than Montana. It's the same size as Oregon. It has, I know you have 1 million people, we have 5. We have some other similarities as well, in that agriculture is very important both in Montana and in New Zealand. And New Zealand is a very important dairying country, exports a lot of fruit and other agricultural products. Tourism is also very important in our country. Some of your listeners may well have visited New Zealand, and it's a country of great natural beauty like Montana. The mountain regions of the US I know are very beautiful. And so we have some similarities, but we have some differences. Those differences are our isolation and our you are part of a much larger country of 328 million. We are a small country and an isolated country. So all of that means that we have had different challenges, but also different advantages to the US in our response. And I think that the secret of getting the curve down has been approaching it from a scientific manner with strong empathetic leadership that has used science but not politics in our response. I'd be very happy to take any questions, Chris, that your listeners might like to have.
Chris, thank you so much for that. Very interesting. We've been talking about COVID-19 in a number of the Connect Montana events, but from different perspectives, from a medical perspective, a public health perspective, an economic perspective, but very interesting to hear a bit more about the political and leadership perspective. I'd like to first go to Dina Mansour. She's the executive director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. Over to you.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for putting this together. It's been a wonderful series that you've done, Chris, on behalf of the Montana World Affairs Council. And thanks so much to the speaker today for taking time so early in your morning. I was just reading The Atlantic, which referenced your prime minister as potentially the most effective leader on the planet. So it's wonderful to hear a bit more about that. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit towards civil society efforts. Here in Missoula, we've had a wonderful local and state government support on fighting the COVID-19, but we've also had tremendous civil society engagement from United Way and from a number of civil service agencies. Drawing from your experience in Myanmar, I wonder if you could speak a bit to what you've seen happening there on the ground, and perhaps also tying it to nonprofit organizations in New Zealand.
Sure. There's a strong NGO and non-profit infrastructure in New Zealand. Much of it is focused on our Indigenous community, the Maori community, where people of colour, with people who live in poor conditions, are more at risk, it seems, under the virus than middle class and upper middle class people living a more healthy lifestyle. Issues like people who suffer from diabetes or weight or overweight and so on are at risk. So local nonprofits have focused a lot on vulnerable groups. So it's both the Indigenous community, on homeless people, and so on. But the government has very much been in the leadership. And I guess in a small country like New Zealand, that's very easy to do because there is a sense of connection to the government. You raised Myanmar. I was talking yesterday to some of my colleagues that are still there, who I was working with until 18 months ago, in my role as the chief UN official in Rakhine State. And I was asking about the response of government to COVID. They were fairly cynical and rather sad that very little really effective work was being done with vulnerable communities or with any communities there. For example, people going into isolation are all put in groups. It's for a month, but there seems to be little follow-up with effective medical treatment. I mean, Myanmar is a very poor country. it's 50 million people. It's very conflict driven, not just in Rakhine, but elsewhere in the country. And I think the impact of the virus in conflict zones like Myanmar and elsewhere in the world is going to be very serious, because not only are people dealing with conflict, with challenges around livelihood and food security, but now they have this extra virus. And in addition to that, the agencies that are supporting them, the UN, NGOs, and so on, will have a lot less funding as governments retrench to cope with this virus. So I'm very worried about countries like Myanmar and how they're going to cope with this global pandemic.
Thanks for that, Chris. I'll just mention quickly that we had Mr. Mark Cutts on the show 2 weeks ago, who's the head of the United Nations Humanitarian Response in Southern Turkey, talking exactly about what Chris mentioned, very vulnerable groups exposed to the COVID virus and what's happening there. Chris, here's a question from a participant. Have there been any editorials or protests against the strict stay-at-home directives?
An excellent question, because one of the things I forgot to mention was that the Prime Minister has managed to carry the country in a quite extraordinary way. You know, politics divide people everywhere in the world, and we of course have political divisions here. But the latest opinion poll says 88% of the population think that the government has taken the right steps in this very draconian lockdown. There have been no demonstrations. There have been, we have an election coming up in September. So some of the opposition have been positioning themselves that either the Prime Minister didn't act fast enough or she acted too fast. You know, the usual political opportunism that happens everywhere in the world, and it's the nature of election years. But generally speaking, the government's actions have been very supported by the population. Our media mentioned yesterday that that latest poll was the best in the world in any country of support for actions governments have taken. So again, making New Zealanders feel very proud that they were doing the right thing.
Chris, I'd like to pick up right there. Since the topic is really about political and overall leadership in crisis. You know, as a government official yourself, as a former UN official, can you talk a little bit about expectations? Constituencies, publics will place certain expectations, sometimes unrealistic, on our leaders. From your perspective in New Zealand, what is the public expecting of its government? Clearly, they're very happy with its delivery, but do you sense any disconnect between social expectation and political leadership?
I think that that in a crisis like we're experiencing, you're experiencing, and everyone's experiencing at the moment with the pandemic, people want to feel safe, and that's not just their health, but also their jobs and their futures, and they want to be told the truth. And I think our Prime Minister and our government have been very effective so far, and this crisis is far from over, but so far, in speaking to the people in a very truthful and non-political way. Politics always underpins things, but the Prime Minister has very much focused on using science. She's used Dr. Bloomfield as the person who answers all medical questions, explains the medical issues, and so on. And so I think at the moment, people are feeling that the government's got their back. You know, that a lot of money has been poured into supporting people in their jobs. The science has been explained. The curve is falling. Our death rate is 19 out of 5 million people, and I think virtually all of them are people over the age of 65. We've had no young people die at all. And the continuing cases that we're getting, less than 10 a day, have all for the last 2 or 3 weeks been New Zealanders who are being stuck overseas in places like Peru and Argentina and Southeast Asia, who are finally being brought home as the government charters flights to bring them home. And some of them are coming back infected, and so they're adding to our total. So, Chris, a long answer to your question. At the moment, I think the vast majority of the population feel the government is meeting their needs. So that deals with the issue of acceptance of rules. Now, no country is going to tolerate being in lockdown forever. So today we start to move out of that into still a very protected situation, but we're starting to ease up on some shops opening and so on, some schools going, some children being allowed to go back, children of essential workers. So I think that keeps the people with you. I think that's really important. You've got to have the support of the population, or it's simply these health responses are not going to work.
Well, that's always the trick in politics, isn't it, Chris?
Yes.
But another question to you, I mean, along the same lines, a number of our guests in the past couple of weeks have discussed changes and things that they would expect to change within their field following this pandemic. We had a medical doctor talk about the changes in medicine itself and how medical professionals deliver that. We had a venture capitalist come on and talk about how capital flows may also be changing following this pandemic. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how governance and political leadership might also change. What kinds of things might you expect in New Zealand and then more broadly around the world in terms of changing in the way in which politics works and leadership is used?
Well, I think the crisis, the medical crisis that we're all facing, has really demonstrated that there's no substitute for government. That less government doesn't necessarily mean better outcomes. At the moment, the crisis has demonstrated that you have to have an effective health system, a comprehensive health system that meets everyone. I made a determination not to talk about US politics when I came on this program because it's not my business to. But you are the only developed country without a comprehensive public health system of which everyone has access, and that I imagine will lead to a significant change eventually in the US, because it certainly in New Zealand has reminded everyone that there's no substitute for government, and that in this crisis or a similar type of crisis, you need a strong, effective government that is inclusive, that speaks truth and deals with the crisis in a competent way. So for governance, I think that people will demand more of their politicians, and that's a good thing. For work and lifestyle, I think we've suddenly learned that you can do a lot of work from home. That's probably going to be a really good thing for people, and a very good thing for the environment, of course, too. We are surviving, keeping most of our bureaucracy and our infrastructure running from home. There's hardly any cars on the street, and we are lucky that we don't suffer as much pollution because of our remoteness and the fact that sea winds blow across our long, thin country often. But nevertheless, the fact that people are discovering that they can see the Himalayas for the first time from northern India, and that the pollution over Europe and North America and Asia has diminished, that might be a good lesson for people too. That may lead to a little bit more interest and a little bit more acceptance of climate change and how we have to address that very important issue as well.
That's a very interesting perspective, Chris. I think that, that it has been this crisis that for a number of people and a number of issues, given us a little better focus on, what is actually necessary, what is actually needed, and how is that effective? And people are still struggling with that question, certainly, but it's certainly been raised and we're talking more about it. So thank you for that. Chris, I'm going to go back to you for any last comments.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for having me on this program, this podcast organised by the Montana World Affairs Council. It's been an honour to be on, and I didn't mind getting up early to be honoured at all. My final comments are that we are all connected together. Our country is about as far from yours as from your state as it's possible to be, but we share so many things, not least of all that we live on the same planet. So, we are both English-speaking countries. We have a common cultural tradition, and sharing among us, not just because of our similarities, but because of our global being on this planet together, is really important. I hope that international institutions like the UN, like the WHO, like our engagement with the non-profits and so on, will grow stronger as a result of having this shared problem.
That's a great message to end with, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us. And as with all our guests, we have an open invitation for you to come to Montana anytime. We'd love to see you here personally when the time is right. Thank you very much for coming
I'd
on.
love to come. Thank you very
Now,
much.
we have for the rest of the week on Tuesday and Thursday, we're very fortunate to have the consuls general from South Korea and from Japan joining us on this show. Both will be at 12 noon Mountain Standard Time, so please come and join us. If you're not able to, or if you've not seen some of our previous shows, they are available on our YouTube channel and on the Montana World Affairs Facebook feed. You simply need to Google it. So please have a look at that. If you have any other thoughts, comments, ideas, please send them to me at info@montanaworldaffairs.org. So until we meet again, hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you very much and goodbye.